my dear friend, cheer up. After all, we have peace. And because there's peace, the occupiers can't behave so abominably anymore. All right, we're not free. But we're used to that, Mr. Kuyavsky. After all, we were both born into slavery, and we'll die in it. Oh, yes, at first they'll exploit us ruthlessly. 14 hours of slave labor a day, a bowl of watery soup, whippings, beatings. But that will pass with time. Because there is peace, they won't have a chance to get any new slaves. They'll have to take good care of those they have already. Cheer up, dear Mr. Kuyavsky. Arbeit macht free. Work makes a man free. And it makes him especially so in the sunshine of European peace. We will lack only one thing, only one, the right of dissent. The right to say out loud that we want a free and independent Poland. That we want to brush our teeth and go on holiday in our own way. Conceive children and work our own way. Think in our own way. Live and die. This is the one thing you will find missing in the sunshine of European peace, which you, my friend, hold to be the highest good. Andrei Shipyorsky. From Sarajevo to Red Africa's production site is currently working on filming a series about the history of Poland and one of Poland's most devoted families. Although we usually try to use the History She Wrote episodes to discuss current events in the context of history, the next few episodes will be devoted to events from Polish history. Although they may not mirror a specific event, it is patently obvious to anyone the central place that Poland has in current world events. To understand the present, we must first understand the past. And in Polish history, there are few events that caused such a shock to the national psyche as what happened to the 16. What was going to happen to 16 of Poland's citizens, the leading members of the Polish underground state, which kept Poland alive and functioning during World War II, was hinted about in ominous warnings by the Soviet Union and Red Army from the Tehran Conference, where, much like Yalta, there was no Polish representation whatsoever. And the big three allies of the US, USSR, and UK collectively decided on their own that when the Nazis were defeated, Poland would fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. The Polish underground state, Stalin insisted, did not actually represent Poland. It was a statement that could have been written by Orwell himself, and anyone that questioned it kept quiet for fear of losing the Red Army to a Molotov Pact redux. Perhaps it's not surprising, but coming as it did on the heels of the Soviet army parking itself on the sidelines while the Germans annihilated the home army during the Warsaw Uprising and completely brought Warsaw to the ground. Not a single person in on the agreement could argue that they had no idea what the Soviets intended to do to Poland. When messages to the Polish leadership started coming from the Red Army in February of 1945, they were ominous. First, a letter sent on behalf of Zhukov requesting a discussion about home army actions against the Red Army, with claims that the home army was attacking the Soviet rear troops. Then, in March, another invitation. This time it was, and I quote, to a clearing of the atmosphere by the emergence of Polish political parties and their combining in the general stream of democratic forces in independent Poland. The Poles made some demands, amongst them the guarantee of basic democratic freedoms. They also said they needed to discuss this with the head of the Polish government in exile, which happened to be in London. The Soviets ever so kindly agreed to provide the Poles with a plane to fly to London. They even provided a statement guaranteeing the safety of the officers. I, as an officer of the Red Army, to whom such an important mission has been bestowed, give you a full guarantee that from the day when your fate will depend on me, that means when you come to us, you will be completely safe, said Soviet Colonel Pimenov. Seemed as though a compromise might be possible. Spoiler alert, it was not. The Polish leadership was flown to Moscow instead. Upon arrival, they were charged with various offenses and remanded to Lubyanka prison, where they were held on a starvation diet, interrogated 8 to 15 hours a day, and tortured. Meanwhile, to the rest of the world, these men had simply disappeared. A few weeks later, Moscow admitted they were in the Soviet Union, supposedly for talks about the new government. It was a position designed to curb questions, but no one believed them. The Red Army had been necessary and crucial to defeating Hitler, but by this point, world leadership was well aware of the brutality they employed as a part of everyday life. Winston Churchill, for one, believed the worst. Under the assumption that the leaders of Poland were already dead, he sent a telegram to Truman. One cannot tell how far such a crime will influence the future of Poland and Central Europe. Faced with mounting questions, the Soviets responded by accusing the Polish government in exile in London of spreading misinformation. Sound familiar? They also had their Western assets start releasing conflicting information so as to further confuse the situation. But the Soviets definitely had a sense of timing. At the same time the question of Polish leadership fate was gaining traction, the first conference to form the United Nations was kicking off in San Francisco. A war-weary world was gathering to discuss a way to prevent future wars. Interestingly, if you check the United Nations page on the San Francisco conference, the very first paragraphs address the fact that Poland alone did not have representation at the UN founding. The official UN article states, one of these nations, Poland, did not send a representative because the composition of its new government was not announced until too late for the conference. The truth, as we know, is that the leaders of the Polish underground government had been kidnapped to the Soviet Union and were unavailable to attend. But perhaps that sort of perfidy is too awkward for hagiography. Finally, on May 4th, about a week into the conference, Stalin announced that the Polish leaders had all been arrested for various crimes against the Red Army. Soviet satellites went into overdrive attacking the men and presenting proof for public opinion. Churchill saw this as an event that would fundamentally change the way the world would align, a primary change in the structure of world forces, as he put it in a note to Anthony Eden. He wanted demands of action against the Soviets and Stalin in particular, but he also understood that nothing was going to happen without the US being on board. And the scuttlebutt amongst the bureaucracy in both the US and UK was that, well, maybe Stalin had a point. It's entirely possible that the Home Army units had attacked the Red Army. It was well known that Poles in general carried over a dislike of Russia from the days of the partitions. Maybe the Soviet charges weren't entirely false. And besides, Stalin was assuring everyone that although the men must stand trial, their sentences would be lenient after all. Western diplomats sent to investigate and agitate for the release of the 16 were stalled and given false information at every turn. But again, the world was weary of war. No one had the intestinal fortitude to provoke another possible fight with a former ally. And Stalin understood this. The trial was held from 18 to 21 June with US and UK observers. 12 of the men were sentenced to prison terms varying from 4 months to 10 years, and 4 had charges dropped. The world breathed a sigh of relief. The sentences really seemed quite tame compared to the sort of thing usually passed off as Soviet justice, and this was calculated, because on paper, everything looked reasonable. The fact that the leaders of Poland had already been subjected to 3 months of unrelenting torture and had been falsely imprisoned to begin with was glossed over by most. Although Churchill, ever the international Cassandra, stated to a colleague, "I cannot view it as calmly as you do, the very heavy sentences on Okulicki and others. Nor can I agree that we can be well satisfied with the conduct of this trial. The fortune of these men, who are sentenced to long terms of imprisonment, cannot be a matter to which His Majesty's government is indifferent." The heaviest sentence came down on General Leopold Okulicki, the commander-in-chief of the Home Army. It was not Okulicki's first rodeo with the Soviet justice system. He had previously been held and tortured in 1941. He had later told colleagues, "In comparison with the NKVD, the Gestapo methods are child's play." When the direction of the political winds became clear after Yalta, Okulicki had disbanded the Home Army in an attempt to save Polish fighters from arrest and murder by the Soviets, who were bent on eliminating all possible opposition. His witnesses were not even allowed at his trial. The Soviets well knew that prison sentences were merely a formality. Once in the prison system, those convicted were at its mercy. Sadism, torture, and starvation were the norm. The lightest illness, untreated as a rule, could result in death, a fact exploited by the jailers as a way to get rid of problems with the veneer of legitimacy. People got sick and died, after all. This was the case for 3 of the 16. About a year and a half after the conviction, those being held near General Okulicki heard him being led out of his cell. He never returned. Official hospital records claimed his death was the result of complications from a hunger strike. Those present who survived dispute the official record. Shortly after, the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs for the underground state died of reported heart disease. His sentence had been handed down at 5 years, but he was apparently not a person the Soviets wanted running around free. Jan Yankovsky, the Deputy Prime Minister of the underground state, and the man who approved the decision to begin the Warsaw Uprising, was sentenced to 8 years. 2 weeks before his scheduled release, he was murdered. Explanations were not given, and his body was never recovered. Of those who were released, Kazimierz Puzak, who was sentenced to 18 months, was pressured to emigrate, but refused. He kept up anti-communist activities after his return to Poland, and was given another prison sentence. This time he did not leave the prison alive. Others were released, but forced to emigrate. The trial of the 16 ushered in immediately after the end of World War II the path of the Cold War. Although the term Cold War had been used in various circumstances previously, it was George Orwell's essay, You and the Atomic Bomb, that ushered the phrase into its present ubiquitousness. In that essay, he warned of a peace that is no peace. Christina Wieszczek termed this time the moment when the Poles started to realize that they may be caught in a hopeless political position and that their sacrifices for the benefit of the Allies may have been futile when it came to their own liberation. And the Polish sacrifices and contributions during World War II had been enormous. Orwell had quite a bit to say about the trial of the 16 specifically as well. When the outcome of the farce was released, he wrote, "Just what were they guilty of? Apparently, it was merely of doing what everyone thinks it is right to do when his country is occupied by a foreign power. That is, of trying to keep a military force in being, of maintaining communication with the outside world, of committing acts of sabotage, and occasionally killing people. In other words, they were accused of trying to preserve the independence of their country against an unelected puppet government, and remaining obedient to a government which, at that time, was recognized by the whole world except the USSR." This is history, yes, but it's also the blueprint that built the present as well as a warning. And it's hard to look at current events and not see the echoes of the past still sounding loudly, along with the same blind eye treatment of leadership the world over. Apparently, some things never change. But those of us observing the flow of history are constantly frustrated by the understanding that things can change, even though they don't.